welcome to the future. My name is Zach Gardner. I'm the chief architect at Keyhole Software. About 3 to 4 months ago, I set off on a little bit of a quest. I scoured my contacts on LinkedIn to find other people that were as curious about generative AI as I was. And thankfully, for you all this day, there were a few people that agreed to talk to me, that were able to give me their insights, their real world advice into what it is that they see that's good about large language models, maybe some of the aspects that they see that aren't good, and just give me a much more well-rounded, much more fundamentally sound perspective than if I tried to just fumble through this by myself. So today on the program, I have Erik Hermansen. I said that right? I got it right?
You did. Nicely.
Awesome. That's a great way to start out an interview, is actually pronounce someone's name right. Just a little pro tip. Thank you very much, engineering director at Bayer. Erik, thank you very much for agreeing to be on the program.
Yeah, glad to be here.
And just as a disclaimer, all the views and opinions expressed in this program are the views and opinions of the participants and do not reflect their employer, any trade organizations that they're affiliated with, and it's just two people just having a chat, just talking about stuff. So to get us started off with, Erik, for those in the audience that don't know you as well as I do, kind of give me your background. Maybe what was your career path? How does one eventually rise to the occasion of becoming an engineering director at Bayer?
A community college dropout, and I was trying to make money to get back to school. And the jobs that this was like back in the 90s, and the jobs that I was getting got a little bit better and better. And finally, I was writing code in one of my jobs. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going back to school to learn how to get a programming job. Okay, I have a programming job. So I never actually got a degree. So I had a consulting business. I won't say it's like yours, but I did do some freelance consulting for some years. And then eventually I thought, like, it seems like all the really interesting projects are getting stolen away from me and they're happening inside the companies after I leave. So I decided I'd just be a regular employee and see what that was like for a while. And worked as an engineer. And then after a bit, there was a time when my manager quit, and I said to her boss, maybe I could take over and do what she was doing, and that led me into management. And then after so many years and so many decades, here I am. I'm a director of engineering. I manage managers of engineers. So yeah, and then all along the way, I've been like very connected to my engineering roots. Like I write code almost every day. I've got personal projects going on, open source projects. It's a way to kind of keep that joy of engineering alive in me and to stay in touch, like with what the field's doing.
Mm-hmm. I think that might have actually been how we connected. I think we were talking about, just how we're seeing people use, I think it was GitHub Copilot and other tools that were able to generate code. And then, 4 months, 5 months later, here we find ourselves. So to kind of get us started off with specifically on the generative AI front, I'm curious if you can talk to our audience a little bit, how an enterprise large language model, it was different from the foundational work that larger companies are doing. And if a company is just not even sure how to get started, what would be the baby steps to be able to enter into this wide new world that we find ourselves in here in, February 2024?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'd say I have a lot of sympathy for people who are looking at all the news coming out about AI and LLMs, and they're just like overloaded. I'm going to give you the one simple trick to like just calm way down. What can we do today? Not what's being promised for next year, not what will take us to Skynet and the brink of destruction. Uh, what is possible today? And if you look at things through that lens, the world gets so much simpler. You get so much more clarity. And for the big, scary problems of the future, you're going to be in the best position to kind of defend against them if and when they ever come up. So like I'd say even like I learned this technique from blockchain and cryptocurrency because it always felt like everything was moving to it. Everyone was all in on it. And then like if you just kind of look and say like at one point in time, what can we do today? Well, the transactions are a little bit slow. That it takes a lot of CPU to, anyways. So like the shortcomings of a technology become clear if you just focus on what can you do today. And the answer with LLMs is there's a lot you can do today. And you don't really have to wait for, AGI or all the things that are being promised from venture capitalists and the foundational companies, because it's right here, right now, and you can do cool stuff with it. So, like at the beginning part of it, I'd say get into like third-party tools inside of your enterprise. Then you can look at internal use cases that you can automate, and because they're internal, there's like less pressure to get them exactly right because you can kind of fail quietly inside of the confines of your own company. And then the more ambitious rung there is like adding features to your products that your customers will use that use LLM-based capabilities. So when I say foundational, I mean like if your company is working on the AI technology itself, if you're training up models and releasing them to the world, if you're coming up with new ways to prune the models or put them onto hardware on edge computing, like that's all kind of foundational stuff. That's a special case area. That's where you need like $1 million salaries and that kind of thing, perhaps. I'm just in the space of what are the kind of more mundane, too dull of a word, but the more practical aspects that you can get done with LLMs today.
Mhm. Yeah. And speaking of which, as it relates to programming, I'm curious your usage of GitHub Copilot. What have you seen? Have you played with it very much? Have your engineers played with it? Where you see it being used for good? And I'm curious if you have any concerns about the next generation of programmers, the ones that come after us. If they're wholly reliant upon this tool, are we going to be in a better spot than we were without it?
Yeah. So Copilot, I got introduced to it about a year ago, started writing code with it. And this is another case of what can you do today? Because like if you listen to the hype, it's um, it's all going to be like no code solutions. All the programmers are going to lose their jobs. Everything's just going to be like push button. You got a whole website that's created after you say in vague terms, make me a customer invoicing system, and then boop, it's there, right? There's nothing like that now. So some people would be disappointed when I say that. Some people would be disappointed when I tell them that all your coders could, on average, have a 30% increase in productivity. They'd say, what? We still have to have them? We still have to have people writing code? Yeah, you do, because the tech just isn't anywhere close to all these sort of stunts you might hear mention of on YouTube. But what I did is I had like a Twitch stream and I would just like write code on a personal project using GitHub Copilot for months. And I wasn't like testing myself at that time, but I did record every single session because I was streaming to Twitch. And then a little bit later, I said, well, how much time am I actually saving using this tool? And I created like a little system to review my videos and say, okay, this type of leap that I made saved me probably about a minute's worth of work. This other one saved me maybe 10 seconds, just like a basic kind of auto completion thing. And I would even like note where it was when I was losing time because like Copilot might give me a bad idea that seemed right, but it would take me some extra time to figure out my code isn't going to work well with that. And what I found with this approach is that personally, like at end of one experiment, I saved about 30% worth of time. I also looked at like GitHub Copilot's papers that they published. I didn't trust them at first because I thought, like, of course, they want to come up with, the most flattering portrayal of their product. But I found that it matched my own experience. So I ended up trusting their reports on productivity increases. So you think about a 30% improvement. That's the closest thing to a silver bullet you're going to get in software engineering, as far as like, can you make everybody faster?
Agreed. I mean, it's definitely been eye opening for me. I did a video cast on it about, so I went the LinkedIn Live route instead of the Twitch route, so to speak, in terms of, kind of showing off and eating my own dog food, so to speak. And I found it was good at being able to create things like model classes where I can tell it, all right, here's a class. This is the name of the class. Here are the properties that I want. These are the data types for those properties. These need to be nullable. These need to be non-nullable. And it did it much quicker than I think I could have ever done myself. So as a code generation tool, it was really good. I also asked it, which was kind of unfair of me, but I kind of asked it a question that I knew what the answer was, but I wanted to see like how it rationed through it. And I found that if I were to not have a fundamental understanding of programming that comes from, years and years of just being beaten down and, being hardened by the school of hard knocks, if I were to not have that foundation upon which to rest, it might be a little bit difficult for me to even know how to like formulate questions. When you and I started programming, we didn't have things like Stack Overflow. We had to hope and pray that we would be able to find someone's knowledge that they wrote about on maybe their personal blog, and being able to even know how to go into like Google search and to be able to effectively articulate what it is that we were trying to find out. So one of the things that I've heard people talk about with this tool is that they're kind of worried about like the generation that comes after us. When you and I are on the beaches of whichever islands we decide to retire to, sipping mai tais or sprites, if you're into that. Like what is that next generation going to be able to do? Are they going to have the same kind of scar tissue? Well, maybe not, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe people didn't have to learn about pointers and memory allocation, like we had to. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious, in your experience, are you seeing this maybe as a tool that managers and directors kind of need to be cautious about, or is it something where it's like, hey, like this is the future, we need to learn how to use this effectively?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot there, but I would break it down like this. Suppose your company doesn't have like a peer code review process, doesn't have like code scanning processes like or tools like DAST and SAST, SonarQube.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose it's just kind of you're depending entirely on the output of a engineer not to put you at risk. You have nothing in place. You're already kind of in trouble if you've got more than like one team in your company.
Mm-hmm.
When you get beyond that sort of like startup, maybe 10 engineers in your company, you need to start getting more serious and have some process in place. And if you do have that process, then it should be able to catch the more major problems that come up. Um, I see it as not too unique there as far as a challenge of like avoiding security problems and code quality problems. Okay, then another thing you mentioned is um, new engineers coming up. What are they going to be like? They're going to like be born in this stuff. They're going to be getting through their college exams. Like, what does ChatGPT say about this? They're going to be kind of blundering through their programming. Uh, so I worry more about the next gen. I think for their sake, they like if you're a person who is just learning programming, turn off the Copilot stuff for long stretches of time. Make sure you got the basics. And if you're kind of like throwing stuff against the wall, kind of guessing, will this work? It's not going to serve you well in your development. And as a company, when you're hiring, there's going to be new practices you want around interviewing. And then, of course, like I just alluded to or mentioned, your internal processes for ensuring code quality need to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I even saw a study where it was like they had GitHub Copilot generate 500 different examples in a variety of different languages, a bunch of different use cases, ran them through SonarQube or something similar to that. And they found that I think it was 30% of them contained just obvious security vulnerabilities. One of the interesting things that I've come across too in sort of my sojourn through the generative AI world, DARPA has a project where they're willing to pay people money to create large language models that will sit there and ingest the code generated by other large language models and identify performance issues, identify security vulnerabilities. So it's like they're using generative AI to be able to help fix some of the limitations of generative AI, which, I mean, that's a pretty good use case, honestly, in terms of, code to code, or code to feedback. So we kind of talked through GitHub use case a little bit. I don't want to beat that horse to death, so to speak, that cat to death. Given that it's GitHub and their logo is a cat. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
are there any other maybe good use cases that you've seen for large language models? Any bad use cases that are kind of harmful? Kind of where's your mind at in terms of the depth and breadth of what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like there's tools or third-party software that's already built, and then there's some stuff there that's out there. And then we move into like, which for me is the really interesting part, is use cases inside your own company and software that you might build to realize those use cases. And there's going to be good ones. There's going to be weird ones that like I wouldn't think of, but like if you're inside your company, it'll mean something to you. It'll be like, let's run a second eval on the TPS report before it gets sent to, right? There's going to be stuff like that, which is total nonsense to you and me, but like to somebody inside of their company, it will mean a lot. So that's like the stuff that I want people to be able to figure out where it is inside their own company. Stuff that kind of doesn't make sense. It's like fool's gold is um, if you try to use an LLM to do something that a regular algorithm could do, it's just kind of usually a bad idea. So like, for example, you could take a document and you could say, let's do a search and replace for all the occurrences of a word inside that document. And there you go. There's your zero code solution for search and replace. It works. The output comes back, but it costs like, I don't know, 1 penny every time you run it or something like that. Well, that wasn't the best use. I mean, that wasn't the best way to do that, right? Other things like if you have something that's really a numerical calculation, or you're trying to make a predictive model that's based on math, like don't use an LLM for that. You could maybe get it to work, but there's like if you can have a machine learning model that's based on weights that output numbers and take inputs as numbers, to add that extra step of having everything converted to text and language and back and forth is probably not right. Um, so yeah, you don't want to use LLMs to do everything, right? The cost of them is a big deal, right? So I might say it costs like a penny to run a one prompt, and you might say, well, that's not very much. But if you had a database server, Zach, if you have a database server that every query costs one penny, is that one you'd recommend to your customers?
It better be a bunch of good data that it's getting back for
Yeah.
that 1 penny.
Right, because that level of transactional cost is much higher than almost any other. Like there isn't really anything else that's like a standard system architecture component that would have that kind of capability to rack up costs. And if you have like a chain of prompts that are used for a use case, like you ask one thing, take the results of that, feed into the next thing. Um, it's, you might get like a 20-cent transaction or something on a use case, right? So the cost is going to be important, particularly when you try to scale up what you're doing. If you've got 1,000 users in your company and everything was pennies one day, but then 1,000 users hop on and it's $40 in one day, it can add up real fast and
Mm-hmm.
get people fired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, at least in terms of database calls, one of the things that, just as an aside, just always gets me is when developers do queries inside of loops. Because it's like, you realize that's a big O complexity of N, because every single time that loop runs, it's going to be hitting the database, hitting the database. And maybe if it costs the developer a penny to hit the database, then they might say to themselves, maybe I should pull that query outside of the loop, do a where X in something or other, and then I get better performance. I reduce the hits on my database. If there was a large language model that could detect as part of a code review process when someone is doing a query inside of a loop, like, Sold. Send me that link. That's just one of my things. I just because it's an RPC. It's a remote procedure call.
Yeah.
PayPal actually has an interesting architecture where all of their queries, you actually can't query the database directly. You have to call an API that is a central location that does all the queries against the actual database.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a database hit, you really have to be sure that it's what you want to do. And so you don't rack up those large transactional costs. So maybe that'll be their approach to LLMs.
Yeah,
Who
and I
knows?
think when your company gets to a certain point of maturity with LLM, what a thing that you might look into is kind of a use case based throttler
Hmm.
or a rate limiter, and you would know for each use case like what the ROI is on each transaction. There's a reason why you would pay pennies for something. It's because you're saving money someplace else or providing something of sufficient value that it's worth it. Um, and so, like, if you've got something kind of like a proxy that throttles traffic, but knowledgeable of individual use cases and the requests coming in are coded such that you can tie it to certain use cases, you would say like, okay, well, this particular user account that's running this use case, we don't want it to go over 10 queries in a day or something. And then you keep things under control that way.
I dig it.
Um,
I
yeah,
dig it.
yeah. Oh, one other anti-pattern I got to tell you
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah,
Oppenheimer syndrome. Okay,
yeah.
have you seen the movie Oppenheimer, or
So
the
good. Oh.
so you get like some hand-wringy guy like J. Robert Oppenheimer who's like he's like feels bad about his impact upon the world, but
Hmm.
he just can't resist digging in on this project that might destroy the world, right?
Hmm.
So you get like some engineer off in a corner who like has this Oppenheimer thing in his head, and he's like, I'm going to make an agent. I'm going to make it so it can go out and query any place in the world, and it's going to be smart. I'm going to have it on a loop, and it's going to have persistent memory. It's going to learn, and I'm just going to let it run over the weekend, see what happens with it. Now, I don't think you're going to build Skynet this way, but I think you will eventually have like some security problems. Like, the Russian business network may find its way into your network, that kind of
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm. Uh,
Um,
there's a really interesting webinar that I listened to from NIST. They're updating their secure software development framework to include recommendations on generative AI because there's just with generative AI there's so many new attack vectors that we had never had to consider before. When you deploy new iterations of a large language model, it's fundamentally different than what we do in the traditional application development space because you're not really deploying new code, you're deploying new data, so to speak. So poisoning the data, making sure that your inputs and outputs are sanitized, like it's a different animal. And there's a lot that if you're just trying to get into this space, that it would be really difficult for you to do sort of by yourself, or even the ability to talk with executives, talk with leaders. There's probably, yeah, like you said, a lot of hand wringing, just a lot of like paralysis in terms of wanting to start using these. So I'm curious if you have any recommendations for what is the right combination of words that someone can speak to an executive or a director and be like, yes, like I get it now. Like what are those words? How can we help the executives that ultimately foot our departments to be like, yes, this is what I want to do now too.
well, I am used to working in a company where um, I don't get to say what everyone's going to do. So my first thing is, can you do this? And sometimes they say no. But I think of like your compliance organization. I'm going to kind of like group it all together, but a lot of times it's like it's multiple teams or it's multiple people, and they can cover things like your IT security internally, your product security. They can cover regulatory compliance, legal concerns. So there's some group of people in a company over 50 employees that's probably there that handles compliance issues. So are they ready to deal with LLM based issues? Are they ready to do that? They may not be. So I think everyone's got their own communication style, but my thing would just be go talk to them and say, what are you ready for? I think I might even ask what they're ready for before I give them a request related to LLMs if there's no past history, right? And then you just have a nice, friendly, non-pushy conversation with your compliance department. Um, that's how I see it. But the benefits are all there. Um, I don't like to be like a very fear-based person, but it's possible your competition is much further along in its LLM maturity, and they're going to be realizing benefits before you. So that's kind of like the thing that maybe pushes the whole thing forward is the opportunity cost of not being ready for LLM-based capabilities.
Agreed. Agreed. That's a great place to leave it. So, Erik, if people want to find out about more about you, if they want to follow you, what social media are you active on if they want to get more?
I'm going to stick with LinkedIn, and instead of like saying out a URL, how about can we leave it like in the
Oh yeah,
comments or the show notes? Yeah.
absolutely. It would be our
But
pleasure.
But I will say I'm on this interview not to sell anything, but just kind of extend myself in a networking fashion. If people have correlated interest or corresponding interest, just send me a connection request and just say, "Hey, I'm also interested in LLMs," or "Saw you on Zach's show," and yeah, probably accept it.
Very cool. Very cool. No, Erik, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time today. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll catch you in the future.